Mark Graben and Jamie Flinchbaugh are two guys drinking whiskey while chatting about lean ideas, experiences, and news. Let's hope they hold their liquor because they're not holding back on sharing their opinions. It's time for Lean Whiskey, Lean Talk with a fun spirit.
Hey, it's Mark Graben and Jamie Flinchbaugh here, episode 2 of Lean Whiskey. Jamie, how's it going?
Going great. Had a good weekend.
Well, good. So it's Sunday night when we're recording this. The weekend's over. We're going to have one more whiskey and talk about all kinds of lean topics today. So I hope you'll, as the listeners, thanks for listening, pour yourself a drink and join us. Well, I mean, I guess not if you're at work and not if you're driving and not if you're on a treadmill, but if you happen to be sitting home in an evening listening to us, pour a little something and join us. So we want to thank everybody who listened to the first episode, everyone who subscribed and sent comments, and it was really nice to hear, right, Jamie?
Oh, I had people stop me in the hallways. I had, text messages and emails, and of course the comments we got on LinkedIn, et cetera. I was actually surprised. I mean, I know we're kind of doing this just to have fun, but I was really pleased that folks were listening in and enjoyed what they heard.
Yeah. So we're doing it again. We're going to give it a shot here. Pun intended at this point.
Intended. Yeah. Can't avoid it at this point.
Yeah. So before we get into lean topics, what have you been up to lately, Jamie?
Well, as I said, I had a good weekend. We had a soccer tournament. So I've been coaching soccer for a long time. Long day. It was a gone 12-hour day, 3 games on Saturday. And the boys worked super hard, played some pretty soccer that people came up and commented on. Even when we didn't win, they commented on how we looked. And then we had another game today, a league game where we were shorthanded and came from behind. Hard-working game that ended up in a rout in our favor, but had to do a lot of work to get there. And then capped it off tonight. Tomorrow, my wife is speaking at Lehigh's graduation tomorrow morning.
Oh, wow.
So tonight was a dinner at the president's house. So hung out with all the distinguished guests that are speaking. And it was just a fun conversation. I sat next to the chairman of the university, and we had some fun conversation. So it's been a great weekend.
Oh, good.
How about yourself?
Well, it's a weekend at home in Texas, just kind of relaxing, but hitting the road again this week, going to Boston and doing a workshop there about my book Measures of Success. So that's one of the things I've been traveling around for. I was in Chicago area and Winnipeg. I'm doing the workshop again at the Lean Healthcare Transformation Summit in June. Hopefully, maybe some listeners are coming to that. So that's definitely one of my favorite events of the year. It's in Washington, D.C. And since this is lean whiskey, or I should emphasize the whiskey, it's lean whiskey. Yes. There is an amazing whiskey bar in Washington, D.C. called the Jack Rose Dining Saloon. So hopefully I'll have a chance to go there again.
Excellent. Well, I'm down there in September for a conference, National Association of Corporate Directors. So I'll have some time there. And I will have to remember that name for when I go down.
Yeah, so kind of going back now into the whiskey segment, what are we drinking? You went to Kentucky recently.
Yeah, so last week, I only just got home Friday. And so I was there on business, but I did get a couple hours to head out to Glens Creek Distilling. And So this is the closest thing to actual lean whiskey. And it is founded by David Meyer, who's well known as the author of the Toyota Way Field book. He's a former group leader at Toyota in Kentucky. And, really not just one of my favorite books about lean, but about Toyota, but also about lean. And I've recommended this book to numerous folks.
Yeah, I mean, it's a book I've liked quite a bit. And that was really, I did a podcast interview with David talking about that one. And there's so much practical detail in that book. One thing that comes to mind, there was a diagram in the book that I've cited and modified in the healthcare settings where they talk about 3 levels of Kaizen. It's not just the big Kaizen projects, and it's not just Kaizen events or A3 problem solving in that middle range. There's in the diagram, there are a handful of really big bubbles. There's more of the small or more of the medium-sized bubbles. And at the bottom are all the hundreds and hundreds of small Kaizens. And I think that diagram illustrates it's not Kaizen events or quick and easy Kaizen or 2-second lean or whatever you call it. This all fits together.
Yep. Yeah, and it was really not just a blend of theory and practice, but it was really more an application book, right? That's why I call it the field book. But enough theory to make sense of the practical application. But the centerpiece was definitely practical application, and certainly got to see him applying that, especially different levels of Kaizen to the distillery. And so I don't know exactly when he started Glens Creek Distillery, but
I think it's within the last couple of years.
Okay, I mean I know he's been doing it for longer because he obviously he's some of these bottles have been aged, but it's on the site of the old Crow Distillery,
defunct distillery. Yeah,
defunct distillery. They shut it down when Jim Beam bought Old Crow, and they moved all production to the Jim Beam factory in I believe the mid '80s. And I don't know if anything's been done with the property since then, but it certainly looks like nothing's been done with the property since the mid 1980s.
Yeah, when I was there, I visited Dave and the distillery last July 2018, and I think he was still just taking inventory of all the different projects and renovations and things. It's quite, I mean, it goes back to the late 19th century, I think, one of the original buildings.
It wouldn't surprise me, and the barrel houses are super old, and you can see some old distilling pots and water tanks and all sorts of other crazy stuff. And it's right next to a creek, hence Glens Creek, but there's a natural spring there that's actually where the water comes from. So I have, I've known Old Crow. It used to be, a century ago, was one of the premier whiskeys, and it's definitely dropped down a few shelves to the bottom. But this, the sort of, I don't want to call it his main product, but maybe it's the highest volume, is what's called OCD number 5, which stands for, he argues it stands for all sorts of things, because
legally, he doesn't want to say it stands for Old Crow Distillery, right?
No, he probably doesn't. But that's certainly the history behind their location. So this is OCD number 5. So I was able to buy a couple bottles and bring them home, and I just cracked one of them open.
As did I.
Joined my first glass.
That was your first sip out of the bottle.
First sip out of this bottle. So, and I hadn't had it until I went to visit, and I got a small tasting. So I of course followed him since he got started. And we actually kind of joked about waste and value add, because every bottle is hand labeled, not just putting the label on, but writing on it the bottle number, the barrel number, the proof. And of course he was nice enough to sign it as well. And we joked whether that was a wasteful task or a value-added task, and I argued since customers appreciate it, it's a value-added task.
Yeah, I agree. Now, did he fill the bottle for you right before you bought it?
Well, he was in the middle of, when I walked in, he and actually a former client of his, when he was a consultant, were busy running through a batch of bottling. So I'm pretty sure it came out of that group, but it wasn't actually filled just for me. But that's okay. It
There was another one he sold me that he did bottle just for me. So, for people who don't, people listening, if they're listening to Lean Whiskey here, probably know something about the process. But, it's aged for years generally in oak barrels. And that is a batch, but arguably that's a value-added product because the whiskey, the OCD number 5 that we're drinking, it's a very dark cola color, and that color comes completely from the wood. When we see David distill it there, it's of course it's clear.
Right. Yeah, it's clear going into the barrel, and it comes out, and this is some of the richest looking bourbon I've ever seen, and I'd have to say some of the richest tasting bourbon I've ever seen. And that's good for some tasters and probably not good for others, but he doesn't cut it with water as some do. So when it comes out of the barrel, it goes into a bottle. But I have barrel number 41 and bottle number 160 running at 113 proof.
Yeah, and I've got barrel 23, bottle 68. It's a 56.6% alcohol by volume, which is fairly high, but it's very drinkable.
Very, very drinkable. And it's not a guzzling whiskey. And I'm having trouble imagining it. Not that I really ever mix a drink, but using it as a base for a mixed drink. I'm sure it's good, but there's so much flavor in it already.
Yeah,
I can't imagine how you do anything to it to make it taste not just better, but a whole lot different. So I think it really is meant to be drank straight as out of the bottle.
I guess all you could do is experiment and see. And, kind of that makes me think of the distillery. And, David had standardized work posted. There are different stages in the whiskey distilling and production process. So he's trying to be, standardized and not make mistakes that would ruin a batch. But I felt there's this real strong spirit of experimentation and Kaizen, like structured experiments with the process and the product. And both of those things matter. Like going back to your soccer discussion, you're looking at the soccer process. Even though they didn't win the game, the process was good. Right.
And, I'll just picking up on the soccer bit. With one game we did lose, we won 2, we tied 1, we lost 1. Game we lost, we kind of had a problem to solve, right? We faced a really, really good center back, and everything we knew how to do, he was able to thwart. And I kind of explained to the boys, they gave you a problem. Our job is to solve that problem. And you get the sense that David approaches this. One of the simplest definitions I use for lean is a passionate pursuit of understanding cause and effect.
Yes.
And it's it's not about 5S. It's not about writing standard work. It's about understanding cause and effect. And if those things are the cause to produce a different result, then that's what you do. And he will explain to you the inputs and what matters and why he's done what he's done. And it's kind of a moving target. But he's willing to go deep enough to understand what really is working as he works to perfect his pursue the perfection of his product.
Yeah, and David gets that as a former Toyota guy. I think to another former Toyota person from Canada, Pascal Dennis, who's written a number of good lean books. Like working with him, some years ago, he really emphasized the idea. I hear people say like, "Oh, we found the root cause." Okay, well, how did you find the root cause? Well, we talked about it. Right. Well, like what Pascal taught me is that you have a hypothesis of a root cause. Now you need to go do some sort of experiment in the process and make sure you understand with your countermeasure the cause and effect relationship. So there's that suspected root cause. There's a suspected countermeasure. All you can do is try it and see what happens and either deepen that understanding or challenge yourself. No, we don't understand cause and effect. Let's keep investigating.
Right. And that's, what's difficult is when you have a product that has to mature for, you're counting it on years instead of months or days or hours, your hypothesis might take a while to be proven true or not. And so you get the sense he's really trying to look at, what comes out of each stage of the process and compare it at that point, understand the differences of different techniques and again, really truly understanding cause and effect in the process. And we talked about this in the last podcast. Where do you start? Well, you start with need. You don't automatically start with a particular tool. You start with need, and that's definitely his approach. He's starting with need. Where does he need to focus?
Yeah. So maybe with that, we can transition. I think we're going to cover two news stories today. The one that Jamie suggested, or I'll throw it to you by asking. Larry Culp has been getting started as GE's new CEO. Where does he get started?
Yeah, so Larry Culp joins GE, and GE is famous and proud of their history of developing managers internally, and that means there's always been a long line of successors lined up ready to go. And so this is first time in a long time that they've brought in a CEO from outside the company, and it just happens to be from a similar company in terms of construct, but very different, Danaher. So Larry Culp basically comes in as the longtime CEO of Danaher, one of the most storied U.S. companies that around from a lean standpoint, and comes into a company with a very mature way of doing things. Whether it's good or bad, it's just mature. It's the GE way. And he's got a tremendous track record with Danaher. He truly, Danaher Business System wasn't something he created, but it was something he cultivated. Mm-hmm. And so the immediate question, I got emails the day it was announced going, this is interesting. What does this mean for GE and for lean at GE? And what's very interesting is he's not going to go around and coach every facility and every leader. So what does he do as the CEO to bring a little bit of the Danaher Business System with him?
Yeah. Well, as the headline says, they call him the production nerd who could just transform GE. So a couple guys, we're MIT guys, I guess, having more nerds running companies. I don't know how his personality, nerd is a personality too, but he clearly has this really deep. So here's a nerdy thing though. Like when you get into something, you really get into something. The article calls him a true TPS nerd. And, I don't know Danaher real well as a company, but I worked for a former Danaher leader. He was my director that I worked under at Honeywell, my last manufacturing company. I was really impressed with him. I mean, he was at, I think, one of the Danaher companies, Fluke, in Washington State. And boy, he had as good of a understanding of lean and what it meant to help turn around operations. I mean, he was really, really good person to learn from.
Yeah, it's certainly they've developed a maturity in what the Danaher Business System is and their ability to get it into place, right? So this is what separates them from Toyota. Most people at Toyota didn't create the Toyota production system. They didn't build it. They entered it and they were immersed and surrounded by it. But it's not that Danaher started quite a while ago, but not as long ago as Toyota. And so there's lots of people that would create the Danaher Business System, or because they were a very acquisitive company, they would acquire a company, send somebody in, and bring the Danaher Business System with them. Yeah. And so that means that it kind of also comes with a bit of a roadmap, or at least a set of lessons learned about how do you go from zero to full on, at least from the Danaher version of lean.
Yeah, and they're doing a lot of turnarounds. through the Danaher business system. And, I've heard stories, they come in and basically tell the executives over the company or the division they've acquired, like, all right, this is the way it's going to be. You're going to embrace the Danaher business system. And that sounds very, non-negotiable. That's part of their business model. And I think it's interesting that they call it the Danaher business system as opposed to the Toyota production system, calling it a business system versus a production system. It's funny, like Toyota has their problem-solving model that's called Toyota Business Practices. So
right.
I don't know if the choice of words here is interesting.
Yeah, so I think Toyota's choice of words almost always seemed almost a deliberate way to mask some of what they were doing. It certainly didn't seem like a marketing person went about it. But, a key central part of the Danaher business system is how they do strategy. And it's not what makes up the Danaher business system, but it's a good example of how they knew it was more than just making stuff, right? And it was how they ran their business, and that starts with strategy. And especially being a company that makes instruments and stuff like that, there's only so many strategic choices an automaker makes. But if you're Fluke, right, you have so many different pathways, new markets to pursue, new products to develop, new acquisitions to make, that strategy was truly a big part of what they did. And this is, it's clearly a cultural transformation for Danaher, and of course I think it needs to be for GE. But it reminds me of the example of, you ask, what can Larry do? He's one guy. Yes, he's powerful, but still just one guy in a sea of many. The impact of Alan Mulally going from Boeing to Ford. And, it took a while for the stories to emerge, but there are certainly examples where these key moments, he as the CEO established a different culture at Ford. And it might not have truly survived when he left the company, but certainly while he was there, he created a different culture. And so you've got to believe Larry can do some of the same things at GE.
Yeah, we're going to come back to Boeing for our second news item here. But, as he tries to change the culture, there was one thing in the article that was interesting. The writer, who's actually a business person, not a full-time journalist and writer, said that Larry Culp told him the system was, quote, common sense rigorously applied. And then he says, but yet it is much more. And I was having that same thought where I think, well, when people say, oh, it's common sense, like, well, sometimes it only seems like common sense in hindsight. A lot of lean practices, I think, are quite counterintuitive when you're trying to change practices or change a culture.
Yeah, and I think, so I think Suzuki was the one who had said lean is common sense after the fact. And while Larry Culp says it's common sense, I think he's kind of saying, it's not voodoo or magic, but once you see it, it seems like common sense, but to get there, it isn't. And I think that's it's a whole lot more, because, you see folks that once they live it, once they see it, once they internalize it, you kind of go, geez, I should understand cause and effect of why I'm getting the result I'm getting. If I don't have a standard, how do I know what result I'm going to get next time? Yeah, sure, sounds like common sense, but actually facing that in advance of having to build a standard or study a problem, that's not always common sense for anybody.
Yeah, so we'll have a link to that article in the show notes. It was from marketwatch.com, and hopefully people will go check that out.
Yeah.
Do you want to move on and talk a little more about Boeing?
Yeah, I think it's I'll just end saying that I think it's going to take us 2 or 3 years to really say to even give Culp a grade on GE. But I think it's going to be an interesting story to watch unfold, perhaps in front of our very eyes. Yeah. So speaking of unfolding in front of our very eyes, you have a much more recent article that focuses on, and this time it is about Boeing.
Yeah, so this was an article. It was in the New York Times, and the headline read, boy, headline gets your attention. Claims of shoddy production draw scrutiny to a second Boeing jet. And the subheadline says, workers at a 787 Dreamliner plant in South Carolina have complained of defective manufacturing, debris left on planes, and pressure to not report violations. So there's a lot to unpack there. I did a blog post about it, comparing what some of the allegations about Boeing, at least, to some of my experiences at General Motors, some of the experiences I've seen or heard about in hospitals where, one thing that jumped out at me, and it was, maybe I'll just leave it for the blog post. There's always a spokesperson ready to say things like, quality is always our highest priority. And the question is, boy, does reality live up to that? Because the allegations here, said there was, in the article, it said a culture that often valued production speed over quality. Spokesperson disagrees. And it says, facing long manufacturing delays, Boeing pushed its workforce to quickly turn out Dreamliners, at times ignoring issues raised by employees. So, it's the other thought I'll add. I want to hear your thoughts, Jamie. But, I don't know the inside at Boeing, and there are, there's often two sides to a story. But, based on experiences in other organizations, I would tend to believe that some of these ugly allegations are quite possible, because I've seen similar dynamics at other, when other places when there's this pressure, unfortunately, for speed, throughput, flow, and I've seen leaders make bad decisions that really hurt quality.
Yeah, and so, the first thing I saw when I read the article, and it both impressed me and concerned me, was that, they said they had interviewed hundreds of people and read thousands of emails, and I thought, boy, if you can't find somebody that has something negative to say after doing all that, then that would be the story of the year, right? So yeah. Of course, if you dig deep enough, you're going to find bad stuff. It's just inevitable, especially with something that complex. So part of me wanted to issue a bit of empathy for the situation, and of course, sure, they trot out their spokesperson to say, of course not. But there's certainly, some when you hear. The pattern wasn't just, okay, fix it quickly and admit it never happened or never admit it happened. It definitely didn't seem to be that kind of reaction. And I think you're going to have problems in manufacturing. It's I don't know exact number of parts that go together for a Dreamliner. I know it's less than it is for their other models because it was designed that way, but it's got to be over 1 million, at least I think. You're going to put that many parts together and have that many people working in a factory, you're going to have some problems. That's inevitable. The question is, what do you do when you have those problems? Right. And it certainly seems like there's a pattern of people bringing up issues and then either a lack of reaction or negative reaction to that problem. So problems certainly weren't welcomed as opportunities.
Yeah, and in the article, and I see what you're saying about, you could find problems anywhere, but there have been lawsuits filed. There have been, numerous whistleblower complaints. So, I think it's not a case of New York Times just digging up something where there weren't already, public issues because of the lawsuits and the complaints. It's really troubling to hear about some of the allegations.
Yeah, and some of what they said, I don't want to say they embraced the problems, but they kind of indicated, oh yeah, we're really good at dealing with this kind of stuff. And I'd remember I'd see companies that would say, oh, we're fantastic at moving really fast, make decisions on the fly. But it's what that really means is we're comfortable with operating that way. We're used to it. Doesn't mean that it's a good thing. And there's a certain part of this where you get the sense that Boeing is saying, sure, these things aren't great, don't sound great, but we're really good at operating that way. It's almost like people say, yeah, I'm really experienced drunk and I've gotten pretty good at it. It's not exactly a good argument to make.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is going back 20 years ago now. It'll be 20 years ago next month. I joined Dell Computer coming out of MIT, and one of the attributes that they looked for and trumpeted, they said, people need to be good at dealing with ambiguity, which unfortunately oftentimes was an excuse when we would try to point out what we thought were better ways of doing things. You almost get slapped back like, well, you need to be better at dealing with ambiguity. But I'm like, but we could reduce some of that ambiguity.
Right. Yeah. And certainly ambiguity is real and people do need to be good at it. But yeah, it's, hey, we're trying to minimize the variation. We're trying to reduce the ambiguity. And so it's like, yeah, don't bring me data. Right. You got to be better at winging it is really what they're saying.
Yeah.
And it's obviously not going to be the best way to operate. But things get pretty serious here. I mean, it's not just a whistleblower, right? And that's where you hear a single whistleblower and you're like, okay, this person was disgruntled.
Could be disgruntled, yeah.
Right. They want to make revenge, but it's numerous whistleblower complaints and then lawsuits based on retaliation from being a whistleblower, which of course is illegal. So, it said in the article, a former quality manager, which, it's one of those positions that I like to believe is filled with integrity. It certainly can't always be true. Mr. Burnett, who filed a whistleblower complaint with regulators, said he had repeatedly urged his bosses to remove the shavings, but they refused and moved him to another part of the plant. And that, that last part, right, is part of the concern. It's like, they didn't even want to fire him at that point. They were just going to say, yeah, we're going to move you over here so we don't have to deal with at least your complaint, whether it was you or the reality of the complaint. We don't want to deal with your complaint, and so we're just going to move the problem aside.
Yeah, there's the internal conflict, but then I thought one other aspect of the story was interesting was, it's not just the problems they were finding or the risks they were finding in the factory. There were escapes, if you will, of defects getting the customers. So, the one quality manager talked about finding chewing gum holding together part of a door's trim. So they're catching those things, but at some point, if they're pressured to ship stuff real quickly, the article talked in particular about Qatar Airlines and employees at the factory in North Charleston. They were forced to watch a video from the CEO of Qatar Airways, who was kind of chewing out the company for not being transparent about delays and the damage and problems. And I could only think how demoralizing and unfair that is to subject all of the workforce to that kind of, video chewing out. That maybe that was a video that just should have been viewed by the executives.
Or at least came along with a, hey, we own this, right? A little mea culpa on their part that says, yeah, we've heard him. We're going to try to do better, and we're going to share it with you in that spirit. Then maybe it's okay. But yeah, certainly, I can't imagine with a product that complex that they get all foreign debris. But having it, dangerously close to the wiring beneath cockpits, having stuff near that loose bolts near engines, I mean, those are things that certainly can be difficult. And I get not always responding to the customer immediately because you might think they aren't really clear on what the problem is. But I remember a story of experience with a client of mine. They were a food processor, and I won't go into who they are exactly or what food they were doing, but they would produce stuff, at stage one, say, and they'd put it in big vats, and they would send some of those vats on to customers who would do further processing of that product, and they would send more product to their internal factories who would do further processing. So same product, doesn't matter which goes where, but some of it's going external, some of it's going internal. So what would happen is that external customers kept complaining because they were leaving shovels inside of the vats, right? They kind of needed that to help organize the materials. And they said that can't be true, because if it were true, then our internal factories would complain too. And so we actually went to the other internal factories and said, hey, the external customers are saying this is happening. Shovels are left inside the vats, but you guys haven't complained. And they said, no, we haven't complained. We're getting free shovels. So they had this problem all the time, but they didn't want to say anything because they were kind of benefiting. But this is, the whole point is it's not easy to get the ground truth, right? Cause and effect again. Mm-hmm. And what is the true condition? Just because you haven't heard about it through the grapevine or through your internal people doesn't mean that it's not true. And that's, I think, taking these claims seriously and exploring them firsthand, right? Go to the Gemba or whatever phrase people want to use, I think is what is certainly called for once you start to hear them.
Yeah, and I think my final thought on this, I tend to look at Boeing, or they're held up so often as one of the non-Toyota exemplars of lean manufacturing. So I would tend to hold them to a higher standard than I would have held General Motors to in 1995 when I worked there. And too many of these 2019 Boeing stories reminded me way too much of 1995 General Motors, and whether it's fair or not, that's disappointing.
Yeah, and I guess, again, as in the spirit of allowing the facts to bear themselves out, if we can ever get, now that serious consequences are at play and lawsuits, et cetera, we may never hear all the true facts. But certainly you can get a sense of patterns, and we hope that if it is a dip in their corporate culture and system of work, that it's a temporary one, and they can climb back up to the pedestal that they've been on many times.
Yeah. So I'm going to call a little whiskey timeout, because I've poured a little splash of a second whiskey from David Meyer and Glens Creek Distilling. This is, I think you have this one too, Jamie. I'm not trying to rush you, but you've got a release he calls Cafe au Lait, right?
Yep, I have I have barrel number 2, so it's still pretty fresh. You probably have barrel number 1.
I've got barrel number 1, bottle 11.
Okay, wow, you're really early, and I've bottle 143, and this is a smaller bottle because I think it's a more difficult production and very unique. So anyway. Very limited, and I since barrel number 2. So I poured myself a fairly large first pour. So I haven't gotten to this yet, but I did taste it at the distillery, and wow, it's rich and flavorful.
It's got a strong kind of coffee note to it, which is I think he's calling it more of a Spanish spelling, Cafe au Lait, O-L-E, instead of a French au lait. But yeah, it's a much lighter color, but it goes to show color doesn't always indicate flavor or richness, or this is a very, very unique whiskey. So I think David's doing a great job with his distillery.
Yeah, no, and this is definitely stands out as something not just different than the OCD number 5, but I want to say different than any other whiskey I've had. I know, that coffee flavor is there very purposefully and by design. But
and I forget the detail. It's from the grain. He hasn't added flavoring. It's not a liqueur with added coffee. No, it's just it's from the way it's distilled.
Yeah, and I got to taste a few of the grains, fresh, right out of the bag. And there's definitely different grains that go into this that I couldn't do justice by trying to remember or written enough in the bottle for me to describe. But it's definitely the difference here is in the grains. It is not just dumping a little coffee liqueur or coffee flavoring and call it something different. But boy, it's got a very unique taste.
Yeah. So one of the final things we're going to do here today, we're always, or at least the plan, as long as they keep coming in, we're going to take reader questions. Sometimes this is called the mail bag, which this was emailed or posted on LinkedIn, so calling it mail bag is kind of outdated. But
yeah, I can't imagine that we're going to get actual physical mail with questions on it. That would be
definitely not a bag full of questions. That's a lot of
mail. Definitely not a bag full of questions. We hire people to open them up and read them. But yeah, so from the mailbox, and this is a question from Bruce, and I knew you'd appreciate this because you're a huge Deming fan and have gone deep to study Deming. But the question is this: Deming, point number 10, saw work standards or quotas as an impediment to improvement and productivity, but many lean efforts involve posting required hourly production quantities based on both demand and tack time at the point of production. So that's just the lead in. The question then is it possible to have a system of production that does not put some expectations of production numbers in front of workers? So what's your first thoughts on that?
Well, certainly it would be possible. I don't know if it would be a good idea. I think, I understand Deming's point that when it becomes a do it or else quota, that gets really dysfunctional. But, I think, Toyota culture or a lean culture would say a standard is just a plan, that a standard isn't a problem. If management reacts badly to the gap, if they're just pressuring people, then those standards could get really dysfunctional. I saw a lot of that in my first year at General Motors. But then when we got a new, Toyota trained plant manager, the gap between the plan of 92 engine blocks per hour and the fact we only made 63, that's just a fact. And it's just, it is what it is. And it's something you work together on. So, I think Deming was reacting to a lot of these old GM type cultures where standards were almost always really dysfunctional.
Yeah. And certainly from that time frame, there's a lot of, just basically meet the standard, meet the quota or else, and you'll get very little breaks. I'm from York, Pennsylvania, originally, which long before me was at least I believe the U.S. Cigar capital manufacturing of the country.
Really?
I don't think anything high end, but they churned out a lot of cigars, and the people rolling them were expected to hit a certain quantity, and that was the process. The only process or management system that existed was a number. That was where it stopped. And I actually met somebody who was a young girl who would, this was a long time ago, but her job was as a young girl to go around and bring water to the people who were rolling cigars, and had a ladle, and basically they didn't stop working. She kind of spooned them some water, and then they kept working. That's, yeah. I believe, when the quota is the management system, that's when you have a problem. If the hourly quantities and the standards isn't about a quota, but about information, and it tells you about normal and abnormal and helps you find anomalies, right? So that you can then solve those anomalies, then it's useful information. And so I don't think it's, as the person is saying, it's posting the hourly production quantities isn't inherently lean or non-lean by itself. It's how you use it that matters. And I think using it to understand the process, to understand where the problems are, and then doing something about it, then it's a very lean method.
Yeah. Yeah. And, going back to the question, Bruce kind of cites Deming talking about standards as being an impediment to improvement. So I can think of an example, though, in healthcare where hospitals quite often have a labor productivity standard. And this is far more complex than the number of engine blocks you're making per hour. This is more about labor hours per unit of service, and it gets it's complicated calculation, but there's a number. And far too often, managers and directors are really, really pressured to not ever exceed the productivity labor hours standard. And I heard somebody, I forget who I'm trying to give credit to here, but somebody one year at the Society for Health Systems conference said, our daily labor productivity standard is the biggest single barrier we have to actually improving productivity. Because think what happens if you never let a manager exceed their productivity standard, there's no slack time for anyone to work on Kaizen ideas that could actually, God forbid, improve productivity.
Right.
And I think that's part of the catch-22 that I wish health systems weren't caught up in.
Right. Yeah, and I think the whole idea of improving productivity or improving flow rate or whatever that might be, it really is getting into one of my favorite words is granular. And and the reason I love that word is the idea is there's more information when you get down to the nitty gritty, right? When you get down to the details. And so I remember an example. I was in a confectionery company, and they bagged their product at I think the equipment was made to go 59 units a minute. And so they're like, oh, we're really proud. We dialed it up to 62. And we're getting sick, so we dialed it up. So we were just running it a little faster than standard. And so I just got out my watch and I stood there for 10 minutes. And what I noticed is that the equipment was running so fast that every single minute it would pause for half a beat. And so I started doing a count. I'm like, you're getting 59. Like, you've turned it up to 62, but you're getting 59. And you had to get into that minute by minute granularity to find out what was really going on. And that's what information is meant to do, right? It's not for reports. It's for finding abnormalities, helping you understand cause and effect, and using that type of hourly data or whatever it might be, most granular you can possibly generate to find opportunities to improve.
Yeah. So thanks, Bruce, for the question. And we've got some other questions that we are going to address in other episodes. I guess if somebody has a question, one way to get that to us would be email. You can email me, mark@markgraven.com. Jamie, what's your email address?
Jamie@jflinch.com.
And there's other ways people can find us online. So as we're going to wrap up here, we have just a final question for each of us to address here. Who is the most underrated or underappreciated or unfortunately obscure lean thinker? Jamie?
Yeah, so there's probably a lot out there that just don't see the light of day and don't get as famous as some of the others. But one of my favorite that I really affected my thinking is Tom Johnson, or H. Thomas Johnson, as his name is written. He's the author of Relevance Lost, which along with Kaplan, which I think was 1987. And what was interesting is that Relevance Lost was basically saying that management accounting is no longer relevant. And what was sort of fascinating to me is that they both agreed on that, right? Tom Johnson and Kaplan, but then they went off and went very different directions, right? So we both had to read this, and I think this is the first time I read it. I just don't remember.
It was the only time I read it.
Okay, well, it's not an easy read, right? So, but we read it as sort of recommended reading before we went to the MIT program, Leaders for Manufacturing, now called Leaders for Global Operations. It was on a relatively short list of pre-reading before we went to the program. And what was fascinating is after that, they both went different directions. So Kaplan is the creator of the balanced scorecard, And so he said, okay, I'm going to do better. I'm going to create a better management accounting system, basically. And that's what balanced scorecard was meant to be. And that, I don't want to say it was a fad, but it went pretty big there for a while and somewhat faded. What Tom Johnson said, and really then articulated in Profit Beyond Measure, is that we have to get accounting out of management. And that's a strong statement, and I don't believe it's pragmatic, not at least in terms of today's laws and requirements, but it shakes you to think about how would you manage without your accounting system, right? How would you get accounting out of management? Because accounting manages transactions, but work isn't based on transactions. It's based on activities, connections, and flows. And so if we had more managers who understood process and more than they understood the accounting, we might be in a very different world. And so Profit Beyond Measure is a book that, I mean, it used to be almost number one on my recommended reading list. It's not, again, not the most pragmatic book, but it can help shape your thinking. And I think Tom Johnson hasn't been as recognized for his contributions to lean thinking as should be.
Yeah, that's a good recommendation. I'm trying. Well, I was just saying, we're thinking about that pre-rating for MIT. I think that was quite literally the first. It was part of the batch of books. The very first things I ever ordered from Amazon.com in 1997, when Amazon was nothing but a bookstore. One day I scrolled back through my Amazon order history. Can't believe I've been buying from Amazon for going on 22 years now.
Wow. Was that a moment of boredom or curiosity? I wonder.
More curiosity. Yeah, I don't think I had to scroll through all of it. I think I could search and jump and
search back to the beginning. That's
fantastic. I tell you, a book I wish had been required reading for MIT, because it's actually a book from MIT Press. So I would have said Deming. We've already talked about Dr. Deming. I wish Dr. Deming wasn't. I wish he was more widely read by people in the quote unquote lean community. But another name I'll throw out in Dr. Deming's lineage is Don Wheeler, Donald J. Wheeler, PhD. And I think his books just say Don Wheeler. They do. I think he's pretty. He leaves the PhD off. He's pretty approachable. Right. His book, Understanding Variation, is one that I wish was more broadly appreciated. I mean, I've certainly, took the lessons from that book and incorporated them into my book Measures of Success, and was personally really thrilled that Don Wheeler wrote the foreword for that book. But over the last 20 years, that's the one I've always recommended. If you were recommending Tom Johnson, I was recommending Don Wheeler. I've given away dozens of copies of that book over the years.
Yeah, and that's one that I believe I learned of Don Wheeler while at MIT, but if I remember correctly, but certainly understanding variation is, a lot of statistical education, including Six Sigma training, which isn't the only way. I mean, I had stats in high school and through 3 different degree programs. But the idea is doing the math is one thing, but understanding variation is different. And I think that was the kind of the focus of Don Wheeler was, again, understanding variation, giving it meaning, not just doing the math, right? Because doing the math is one thing. Lots of people can do that, but having an appreciation for variation and its abuses as well as its benefits is a whole different game.
Yeah. So as David Meyer's whiskey evolves, it would be interesting to study the variation from barrel to barrel and bottle to bottle. Some of that variation is just makes it interesting.
And his argument is, as many as the big houses will claim they have a perfectly standardized process, every barrel doesn't come from the same tree or from the same woods or from and that's one of the big ingredients of flavor. So there's natural variation in that, grains and waters and wood, and there's just inherent variation in the whiskey process. And some of that's good, some of it's bad, but at the moment, I've gotten to catch up with you, pour a little cafe au lait, and I'd have to say it's good.
It is. And as we wrap up here, so I don't have an empty glass for final cheers. I've been doing little pours, I think, relatively. I'm drinking out of a Glencairn glass. You might hear Jamie's large ice cube rattling around in his nice glass there.
Yep, I did. I had a hot weekend and out of the soccer field, so I felt an ice cube, which I don't do often, was called for, but it's in there in my nice crystal glass, which was a wedding present.
Nice. So I want to remind everybody, for one, thank you for listening. You can find more information about the podcast and the past episode, I guess, and we'll say past episodes in the future. You can subscribe and learn more by going to leanwhiskey.com, or you can go to leanblog.org/leanwhiskey. Jamie's also got a page.
Yep, I'm at jflinch.com/leanwhiskey.
You can also look for us at Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify. I guess if you are listening, well, unless you're listening to this through the web page and the streaming player, you're probably listening to this through a podcast service. So you can search for us or click or tap, and hopefully you'll want to hear more.
Yeah, and please do, rate us, review us, subscribe to us. It's not vanity, really. This is what helps other people find us, and hopefully enjoy the company that Mark and I enjoy together. So please do that. Rate, review, subscribe, and other than that, cheers.
Cheers, Jamie. Thanks for doing this again. As well, try not to make an obnoxious glug 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 type sound.
Yeah, I thought.